Halo Effect by Alex51324. Chapter 5. In the days leading up to the removal of the household to London, Carson kept Thomas so busy that he barely had a chance to glance at a newspaper. As a result, the news of the assassination of an Austrian archduke would have passed him completely by, except for a conversation overheard while he was serving dinner, in which Lord and Lady Grantham attempted to remember whether they had ever dined with anyone who had dined with him. It wasn't until the first night in London, when he was attempting to catch up with his correspondence in the tiny attic room that he was being forced to share with William for the next month, that he received the first hint that this event might ever affect him in any way. In a letter mostly devoted to the plans for Kew Gardens, Peter wrote, "By the way, Liesl wanted me to make sure that you and A know that she's Swiss and not German. Thank you very much. She says that everyone on the continent is looking sideways at Germany right now, convinced they'll use this thing about the Archduke as a pretext for some sort of show of force. And Sir H was holding forth the other day about how, if they do, we'll have to take France's side against them. Though how France comes into it is beyond me. If you understand it better than I do, please explain it to me." In any case, Joey, who would know, has said that they're already drawing up plans for mass mobilization. But perhaps they do that anytime there's even a hint of something happening. It'll probably all come to nothing, so I only hope it doesn't cast a shadow over your time in London. Thomas didn't understand it any better than Peter did. In fact, he understood it quite a bit less. Stuffing the letter back in the envelope, he said to William, "Do you suppose we'll end up going to war?" "What?" William asked, looking baffled. "Over this business with the Archduke." "Why would we?" Never mind. Satisfied that he wasn't the most abysmally ignorant person in the room, Thomas turned his attention to a letter from Theo, which was full of complicated details on which bars were the most interesting on which nights of the week, should he manage to slip away unexpectedly one evening. He expected he would, but before it could even be thought of, they had the ordeal of a London dinner party to get through. Ostensibly, it was in honor of the woman who'd presented Lady Sybil at court earlier in the year, but its real purpose was to announce open season on the Crawley sisters. Their London house, like all London houses of its kind, was set up to comfortably accommodate a large dinner, which meant bugger all space was left over for anything else. Even the family's living quarters were a bit cramped, by their standards anyway, and downstairs was a rabbit's warren with everything needing to be carried upstairs through a maze of dark and narrow passages. It would serve them all right, Thomas had many occasions to reflect, if he broke his neck trying to get to the dining room before sauce cooled or the ices melted. When at last the guests had gone and they were slumped over the servants' hall table catching their breath, William said, "Makes you appreciate how much nicer everything is at home, doesn't it?" "Oh, shut up," Thomas told him. The next day there was all the cleaning up and putting away to do, but upstairs the invitations rolled in as expected, and soon came the blessed night when all the family were out of the house with engagements that will keep them well past midnight. After an early supper in the servants' hall, Mr. Carson announced stentoriously that he'd be going along to his club now. He belonged to one for butlers, and "I trust I can rely upon the two of you to mind the door and the telephone." "Yes, Mr. Carson," they chorused. As soon as he'd been gone long enough there was no chance of him popping back in for an umbrella or something, Thomas said, "Right then, I'm off." "What?" William asked, dumbfounded. Then, once he'd caught on, "You can't! We're supposed to answer the door." "Does it really take two of us? There's no sense both of us wasting our evening." "Then why do you get to go?" "Because I'm first footman, you little tit." "Have you got anything better to do?" "No? Didn't think so." "I have." William still looked mulish, so Thomas added, "If you think of something to do, I suppose you could have the next one." William sighed. "I'm not lying for you. If Mr. Carson asks you point blank whether I was here all evening, go right ahead and tell him I wasn't," Thomas assured him, secure in the knowledge that Carson would not ask. "What if he comes back before you do?" That wasn't likely either. Carson didn't get many chances to let his hair down. He'd make the most of it. Tell him I stepped outside a while ago, which is no lie, because I will have done, and I'll figure the rest of it out later. Possibly something about a stray dog he had to return to its home, or a lady deposited on the wrong street by a taxi. After galloping all the way to the top of the house and back again to change his livery for his best off-duty suit, and a quick glance at Theo's letter to confirm where he was going, he was free in the night air, bound for the Criterion Bar. The place was mainly good for picking up toffs, which Thomas was out in the mood to do, even if he'd had the time. But he'd be pushing his luck to risk anywhere that might be raided when he wasn't even supposed to be out. Fortunately, several of his own set were lined up along the bar, not having picked anyone up yet, and he joined them. Peter wasn't among them, nor Theo, or Michael, or Reg, or a few others he'd have particularly liked to see, but he bore up manfully under the disappointment and allowed Syl to kiss him on the cheek and called him darling, saying only, "Hello, Syl," in response. Once he'd been set up with a drink and introduced to those of the group he didn't already know, someone floated the suggestion of moving on to somewhere more exciting. "Can't," Thomas said, lighting a cigarette. "As we speak, I'm minding the door at Grantham House, ready to spring into action should anyone knock on it." One of the new fellows, Drew, Thomas thought his name was, or at least that's the one he'd given, said, "You better shift it if you want to hook one before you've got to go back." Thomas made a quick scan of the talent on offer before saying, "I don't fancy it, really." "You're the one who came up with that game, weren't you?" asked one of the Daves. There were 3 of them, all blonde, and Thomas could never remember which one was which. "Having it off with as many as you could of the men the daughters in your house had danced with?" "It was," Thomas said, "but I got tired of it," Syl explained. "Poor Thomas hasn't quite been the same ever since he was seduced and abandoned by a wicked duke." That wasn't quite the way that Thomas would have put it, but it wasn't completely wrong. "As a matter of fact, he dumped both of us on the same night. First Lady M, then me." "Have you seen Fitz yet?" the Dave asked. Some of them called Peter that because there was another Peter too. "He says you've got all sorts of plans." "Not yet," Thomas answered. "I don't know what it is you did up there on the moors or whatever it is, but he is counting the days, darling," Syl informed him. "Counting the days." "Good," Thomas said. "And it's Dales. Yorkshire's got Dales." "Moors, Dales, Fens, what difference does it make?" "Rather a lot. Thomas wouldn't be caught in bed having an assignation in a fen." But he didn't argue the point and changed the subject by asking Syl, "How'd you like working with Theo, anyway?" That simple question unleashed a flood of anecdotes too lively to be entrusted to the Royal Mail, which carried them through until it was time for Thomas to tear himself away. Past time, really. He was in the middle of changing back into his livery when Carson got home. But that was all right. As far as anyone knew, he might have been visiting the toilet, which not even Mr. Carson could prevent them from doing. The next few days were similarly slack. Carson didn't go out again, unfortunately, which relegated Thomas to spending his evenings playing cards with William and Bates in the servants' hall. But he and Anna did manage a trip to Oxford Street, where he played the old hand in showing off the most impressive shops. Anna wasn't too surprised to find London anything but the easy holiday it was to Thomas. The family spent most of their time whirling from one social engagement to the next, which left very little for the footman to do, other than accepting cards during the calling hours. But the more invitations the girls had, the busier Anna was. They could easily go through 6 or more changes of clothes apiece in a single day, if they had, for instance, a morning's ride, followed by a luncheon, and then a tea, a small dinner, and then crowned it all off with a ball in the evening. A luncheon and a tea may or may not call for the same dress depending on the relative status of the hostesses, and a dinner dress could only be worn on to a ball if the dinner was a particularly grand one. Shopping, musical events, and theater parties introduced additional complications. One evening she was dressing them all in the room that Lady Edith and Lady Sybil shared, a source of great strife, and Anna was sometimes hard-pressed not to make it known to them that she was currently sharing a bed with another housemaid and a third girl in the room with them, all in a space the size of a matchbox, and she was glad to do it because the alternative was rooming with Miss O'Brien. When Lady Mary asked, "Have you gotten to do anything fun while we're in town, Anna?" "I've had a few nice walks, my lady," she said, putting in hairpins, "and I had the chance to look round the big shops when I was getting your stockings." "Is that all?" asked Lady Sybil. "Some of us were hoping to get a party to go to Kew Gardens," she admitted. "Kew Gardens," Lady Mary said. "I'm not sure that was still fashionable when Granny was a girl." "I dare say if it was too fashionable, we wouldn't be comfortable going there, my lady," Anna pointed it out. "But in any case, I'm not sure we'll find the time." "Oh, but you must have a proper day out," Lady Sybil enthused. She met Lady Mary's eyes in the mirror. "How can we arrange it?" Lady Mary considered it. "Any minute now, Mamma will start wondering if all this excitement is quite good for our health, and she'll insist we each spend a day resting. We must all agree to the same day, and then Anna should be able to slip away." Anna wasn't entirely sure it would work. It was the matter of Thomas and his friends managing to be free on the same day. But she only said, "That would be kind of you, my lady." The three girls set about comparing their social calendars, looking for engagements that they were willing to miss, or rather, Lady Mary and Lady Sybil chose a day, and then Lady Mary browbeat Lady Edith into agreeing to it, although she said that the play she'd been asked to was one she particularly wanted to see. Anna felt a little bit sorry for her, but only a little bit, as Lady Edith had had her choice of things to do every day since they'd gotten here. She told Thomas of the arrangement at dinner that evening, and thanks to the efficiency of the London post, by the next evening he had a reply from his friend saying that he and the governess, whose name was Liesel, would manage to be free that day and meet them outside Grantham House after lunch. Anna left it to Thomas to arrange his own freedom, and to her surprise he elected to do so by saying in the middle of dinner, "Mr. Carson, as the young ladies have said they won't be needing Anna on Tuesday, we thought we'd have that visit to Kew Gardens then, if that's all right with you."
Mr. Carson clenched his jaw.
"There's no one dining, and the ladies won't be at home to visit us, so it seems a good time."
"And was anyone going to ask my opinion of this?" asked Mrs. Danner, the London housekeeper, fixing Anna with a gimlet eye.
Anna hesitated. As acting lady's maid, she wasn't really under Miss Tanner's supervision. Before she could think quite how to say that, Mr. Carson answered,
"Miss Hughes has already given Anna her permission for this outing."
Anna could practically hear his teeth grinding as he said it, but he wouldn't allow Miss Tanner to pull rank on Miss Hughes, not even when he disagreed with her.
"They aren't going alone, are they?"
Miss Tanner demanded.
"I am given to understand,"
Mr. Carson said with great dignity,
"that the rest of the party comprises the valet and governess of Sir Henry Denham's household."
Miss Tanner attempted to stare Carson down, but folded, saying,
"Very well, but I will need to see these people to make sure that they are respectable companions for a maid under my charge."
Having won the battle, Mr. Carson magnanimously conceded that point to her.
"If you think it best."
"So we can go then?" Thomas put in with just a hint of a question.
Mr. Carson glowered at him.
"I suppose it's as good a time as any for your half-day."
Thomas looked for an instant like he might kick at that. The others had had their dates without using a half-day for it, but wisely decided to take what he was given. "Thank you, Mr. Carson." When they went up to bed that evening, Anna had to endure rigorous questioning from her roommates, who, as London staff, were not nearly as familiar with Thomas as the Downton staff were, and were under the impression that she and Thomas were sweethearts. "No, it's nothing like that," she told them. Thinking back to the story Thomas had spun in the servants' hall at Downton, she said, "His friend wants to introduce him to the other girl who's going, the governess. Miss Hughes has been letting us go out mixed parties of 4 lately, so it seemed the best way." That led to further questions about these mixed parties, and whether or not Miss Tanner could ever be persuaded to allow them, which fortunately required no further disassembling. It was with some trepidation that Thomas wrote to Peter that they'd now be required to submit to Miss Tanner's inspection before going out. Peter's reply indicated that he was unconcerned at the prospect. perhaps because he'd never met Miss Tanner. But Thomas didn't have much time to be relieved about it, because he also said, "By the by, I've managed to get my hands on a bottle of champagne, so if you two can wrangle a picnic tea out of your cook, we should do pretty nicely all round." Thomas usually put himself in charge of drinkables and left the food up to the other party, precisely because it was a lot easier stealing a bottle of something than talking anything out of Miss Trout, the temporary cook Miss Tanner had hired when they decided that Miss Patmore was too blind to accompany the household to London. At least not without answering a lot of questions about why he wanted it. Granted, on this occasion his plans were no secret, for the most part, but he still quailed at the idea. He was of the opinion that Anna was better suited for the task, but when he suggested it to her, she shook her head. "It's your date. You're on your own." In the end, Miss Trout grumbled quite a bit, but on the day of, produced a decent enough basket of sandwiches and biscuits, surprisingly, because she didn't put nearly as much effort into the servants' meals as Miss Patmore did. Changing out of his livery after the upstairs luncheon, Thomas dithered a bit over his choice of suit. He'd have liked to wear his best one, but they were likely to be sitting on the ground, weren't they? In the end, he went with his brown one and a new tie. Despite the dithering, he was still left cooling his heels by the back door, smoking several nervous cigarettes while they waited for Peter and what's-her-name to show up. Thomas knew perfectly well that her name was Liesel. Anna joined him at about the time they were supposed to meet the others. Glancing down at the pile of cigarette ends at his feet, she asked, "How long have you been out here?"
"Not long,"
Thomas lied.
Anna huffed slightly, but didn't argue.
It was all Anna could do not to tease Thomas about how obviously nervous he was. Obvious to anyone who knew him more than a little anyway. As if the turning up early weren't enough of a clue, he kept taking off his hat to check his hair in the window pane of the back door. Thomas's beau, when he arrived, was not nearly as handsome as Anna would have expected. She would have thought Thomas would only bother with someone even better looking than he was. But Peter Fitzroy was fairly ordinary, with sandy-colored hair that curled a bit, and a nose that was a little small and a mouth a little large for his face. But when he caught sight of Thomas, his face lit up very much as William's had when he saw Daisy pretty enough to go to the fair. They greeted each other as Fitzroy and Barrow, with an enthusiastic two-handed handshake that went on just a second or two longer than usual before breaking apart to make introductions. Liesel was not the tall, severe blonde that her name and profession had conjured up in Anna's mind, but a small, plump woman with curly brown hair that threatened at every moment to escape her hairpins. She quickly agreed to be on first-name terms with Anna, and, clasping Thomas's hand in both of hers, said, "Peter has told me so much of you, I feel that we're friends already," in a vaguely continental accent. Mr. Fitzroy greeted her a little more formally, with an ordinary handshake, and, "Miss Smith, I'm so glad you could join us." They all trooped inside to submit to Miss Tanner's inspection. Anna would much rather it have been Miss Hughes instead, and cringed inwardly when the housekeeper, looking at Liesel, said suspiciously, "You don't look very much like a Swiss governess, Miss Schatz." Liesel only smiled pleasantly and said, "It is true. We're a very mixed people in my country. On my father's side, we are Swiss German, and on my maman's, Swiss French, with a bit of Italian for flavor."
"She's brilliant at languages,"
Mr. Fitzroy added. Miss Tanner had little choice but to accept this explanation, and they set off, Liesel explaining that there was a tram they could catch not too far away, and taking Thomas's arm to lead the way. Anna followed on Mr. Fitzroy's arm. He seemed a little wary of her, stiffly asking the usual sorts of questions about where she was from and how she liked London. He finally unbent a little when she gave him the opportunity to talk about Thomas, asking if they had been friends for long. "Oh, ages! Since he was a junior footman at Lady Waterstone's." He said this as though Anna must have known all about it, though in fact none of them had the slightest idea what Thomas had done before he'd come to Downton, except that he must have been in service somewhere to have gotten the job. "He had kind of a hard time at first. I mean, you know how he is. Wanted us all to think he'd been born knowing everything there was to know about running a great house." The fondness in his tone was unmistakable, though it sounded to Anna as though he must have been insufferable.
It's hard to imagine him younger. He's so self-possessed.
Fitzroy said in a tone of agreement. You know how almost everyone goes through a stage growing up where they sort of look like a molting ostrich? It wasn't a comparison Anna would have thought of on her own, but she knew at once what he meant.
Yes?
Not Thomas. One day he was tiny and adorable. He used his hand to indicate a height considerably shorter than Thomas's current one. And overnight, he looked like that. He gestured to indicate current appearance. Really unfair. I was awkward and spotty for years. Anna giggled, and Thomas spun around, nearly bowling Liesel over in the process. Are you talking about me? He asked suspiciously. What else would we be talking about? Fitzroy asked. I was only telling her how cute you were as a junior footman. I was never cute, Thomas declared, but he was smiling as he said it. No, of course not, Fitzroy said innocently. I must have been thinking of someone else. Satisfied, Thomas turned around. Once he was facing front again, Fitzroy mouthed the words, so cute, to Anna. He was like a really angry kitten. Now that Anna could almost imagine. When they boarded the tram, Thomas could sit with Peter. It was just a little fast for a man and woman to share a seat, so for a party like theirs, the most respectable option was for the men to sit together and the women likewise. The girls sat behind them, and so, by turning half sideways to talk to them and stretching his arm along the back of the seat, Peter managed to come very close to putting his arm around Thomas. And, in fact, by tapping his shoulder as though to emphasize a point, actually did so for a fraction of a second. If they were going to get away with sitting like that, though, it had to be apparent to any observer that they and the two girls were together, which meant finding a subject that all four of them could talk about. Once they'd said all they could think of about the weather, that subject turned out to be the news from Europe. At home, Liesel said, the talk has moved on from whether there shall be a war to whom we ought to side with, France or Germany. How is France involved? Anna asked. I know Germany's expected to take Austria's side and Russia to take Serbia's, but France seems far enough away not to be bothered. Liesel launched into a complicated explanation involving treaties between Serbia and Russia, Russia and France, France and Britain. Thomas supposed she must be a fairly good governess because while she was talking about it, he almost felt that he understood it. Wait, he said once she'd finished. The Serbians are the ones who started it all by assassinating the Archduke, but we're taking their side. Well, one could also say that the Austrians started it by seizing territory which was not theirs in the Bosnian crisis a few years ago, Liesel said. Or that either of these things might be overcome if Germany were not so eager for a war, or if Russia were not. So which is it really? Anna wondered. Liesel shrugged. All of them? None of them? In any case, my papa is glad I am in England at this time. Even if England does join the war, it should be safer here than anywhere on the continent. For you, maybe, Peter said with a sigh. Sir Henry is already talking about how it's our duty to enlist if there is a war. I gather he thinks doing without a valet and footman will be his contribution to the struggle. Lord Grantham better not get any ideas like that, Thomas said. I'm not going unless they drag me kicking and screaming. If you do that, they shove you into the infantry and you're cannon fodder. Peter disagreed. If you sign up early, you get some choice in where you go. Eddie says the medical corps isn't too bad. They work it like a dog, but at least you're in a safe, clean hospital, and nobody can say you aren't doing your bit. I'll go for that if it comes to it. He had a point. I suppose if you have to go, Thomas conceded. I don't much fancy my chances of getting another place with a reference that says, I've been sacked for refusing to serve king and country. Peter answered. They all thought about that for a moment, until the tram began slowing for their stop. Liesel said, It's a lovely day in the English summer. Let's not spoil it by talking of gloomy things. That was fine with Thomas. Once they had disembarked, Anna suggested the next topic of conversation, asking Liesel, What made you decide to come to England as the governess? Well, she said,
I had taught English and French to little German girls, and English and German to little French girls. So teaching French and German to little English girls seemed the next step. No?
Do you mind being so far from home? Thomas wondered. He'd hated moving to London when he'd first gone into service, and he'd hated leaving it when he got the job at Downton.
Sometimes, she said, but I have always wanted to travel. You know how in the silly novels they say that the heroine's fortune was in her face. My fortune is in my brain. My father, he is a schoolmaster, like in your village schools here, so not much money, but I had a good education. As good as any boy gets. Everywhere the fashionable people want a foreign governess, so I can support myself wherever I go.
Liesel has itchy feet, Peter said fondly as they passed through the gates into the gardens. Never stays in one place too long.
I don't think I'd care for it, Anna said. Being away from everyone and everything you know. It is not for everyone, Liesel said politely. Now shall we aim for some destination in particular, or simply see where our feet take us?
Automatically, Thomas turned to Anna for the answer, but she said,
Why don't you choose?
No, right. This was supposed to be his date. Though how he decided who did what when two blokes were on a date, Thomas had no idea. The question had never arisen before in his life. Well, the pagoda's supposed to be good, isn't it? He found a guidebook in the library at Downton, but it was several decades out of date. Let's head for that and see what else we run into on the way. The others agreed to this plan, and they set off. In the circumstances, the chaperones couldn't follow at a discreet distance, but since the path was wide and the garden not very busy, Thomas and Peter were able to walk side by side, with the girls to either side of them. They couldn't hold hands, of course, but they could sort of knock their elbows together once in a while. It was, Thomas reflected, going to be the longest time they'd spent together with all their clothes on since they had been working in the same house. What had he been thinking? They couldn't even hope to find a private corner to kiss, with Anna and Liesel wondering where they'd gone off to. When do you need to be back? He asked Peter. Maybe they could go somewhere else after this. I have to dress him for dinner, but I could slip out again after, Peter answered. You? That sounded promising. It's supposed to be my half day, unless I get roped into something when I take Anna home. He glanced over at her, walking on Peter's other side.
I'll need to dress the young ladies for dinner as well, she said, and I won't be slipping out again. I'm to be back for nursery supper,
Liesel added. While Anna and Liesel talked about the difficulties of getting away from their respective charges, Peter said quietly, So, meet at the crit, then dancing? Dancing had to mean the club they had talked about when they last met. Peter had said it had a dance floor. Sounds good.
Do get out quite a bit with the children,
Liesel was saying.
Like that.
She nodded towards a primly dressed woman who was reading a guidebook aloud to several bored children.
Although I have not been here before, Lady Denham does not think it fashionable enough.
I don't suppose it's much fun, Thomas observed, looking at the other governess.
Well, not if you do it like that,
Liesel agreed.
But if you let the children choose what they are drawn to, and then find a way they can learn something about it, that is more interesting for all concerned. For instance, I might ask what they think that is.
She indicated a large glass house that was just coming into view. Thomas knew from his guidebook that it was called the Palm House. They grew tropical plants in it. He said as much, and Liesel said,
That is true, but if you were a child and did not know that, what might you think about it?
To Thomas's surprise, and possibly her own, Anna said,
It looks a bit like a giant bird cage.
It actually did. The middle part, anyway. There was a sort of dome at the middle, like a birdcage, though the two wings to either side stretched further than they would on an actual birdcage. Now that she'd mentioned it, Thomas was surprised anyone could look at it and not see that it resembled a birdcage. So what? He asked. How are they learning anything from that?
Thomas!
Anna scolded. I'm just saying. It's not like any lesson I ever had in school.
Well,
Liesel said with an expression of mock sternness,
if they are like you and would prefer a proper lesson to thinking for themselves, I would open my guidebook and say it is thus and so many feet long and such a number of feet wide, so what is the area?
Thomas thought about that for a moment. Right. Birdcage, you were saying?
In teaching the very young child, I might ask how big she thinks a bird would have to be to require a cage so large, and then what such a bird might eat, and where it might live, and things of this kind, and so she would show me what she knows of birds and their habits.
She really is good at this, Peter said proudly, as if he'd had something to do with it.
And then I would ask her older sister, who knows that it is really a house for plants and thinks the little one silly for saying otherwise, to think about plants and birds. What needs do they share that might account for the plant house being similar to a bird cage?
The discussion of possible answers to that question took them the rest of the way to the glass house, where they decided to have a look at the tropical plants inside. As the name implied, the centerpiece was a collection of palm trees. They had palms at Downton, so Thomas was not expecting to be particularly impressed. But there was something a little arresting about the enormous heights they grew to when not being kept in a pot in the front hall. When Liesel began pointing out some details of a trunk to Anna, who appeared interested, Thomas took advantage of their distraction to wander away with Peter. I read somewhere they're actually a kind of grass, Thomas said. It had been in the guidebook that he read it. Not trees at all. Really? Peter asked, letting their arms brush against each other. That's what he said. Not that it was in any way important. What do people talk about on dates anyway? I don't know, Peter said. You're the one who's been going on them all this time. Well, not really, Thomas pointed out. I don't imagine you talk about anything in particular, really, Peter suggested. You just sort of wander around saying a lot of nonsense and thinking about what you'd do if you were alone together. Oh, good, then I'm doing it right, Peter laughed, a little bit backwards maybe. And this, Thomas thought, was where they'd be kissing if they were a normal couple who had just given their chaperones the slip. Instead, he looked away. I wish... But he couldn't even say what he wished. I know, Peter said. Then, after a moment, we'd better go back and find them. It was, Anna thought, as she watched Thomas and Peter emerge sheepishly from a grove of palm trees. Both surprising and not to see how Thomas was around someone he actually likes. He was every bit as prickly and sarcastic as normal, even criticizing the way Liesel did her job, for heaven's sake. But Peter never seemed to take offense, and somehow that made the awful things Thomas said seem almost affectionate. She wondered how things might be different at Downton if they could manage not to mind when Thomas was being Thomas. She also wondered if they'd been kissing back there behind the palm trees. Probably not. Thomas wouldn't do anything so foolish in public, would he? They resumed walking through the great greenhouse. The walkways were narrower than the ones outside, requiring them to go 2 by 2 instead of 4 abreast by unspoken agreement. Anna and Liesel occasionally pretended great interest in one plant or another, allowing Thomas and Peter to go on ahead for a bit. It wouldn't seem odd to anyone who happened to be watching, since everyone knew men had less patience than women and tended to charge through any sort of exhibition, as though the point was to walk past as many objects as possible in the time they had. And Liesel did in fact have interesting things to say about many of the plants they saw, so it wasn't much of a hardship. Anna hadn't been sure about socializing with a governess. Governessing was a respectable occupation for middle-class women. Nearly the only one. And while someone like Lady Mary might not see much difference between Liesel and Anna, from where Anna stood it was nearly as wide a gulf as that between the governess and Lady Mary. But for all her education and sophistication, Liesel wasn't the least bit stuck up. She asked at one point how long Liesel had known Mr. Fitzroy, wondering how a governess had come to be friends with a valet. Oh, for 2 or 3 years now, she said. Of course, we only see one another when Sir Henry comes to Devonshire, or when Lady Denham brings the children to London, but we're right. He is a very interesting person. And you don't mind about... She gestured towards the pair ahead of them. Why should I? It is very convenient to enjoy the company of a charming gentleman without wondering where his hands will go. She had a point, Anna had to admit. I suppose it is the same for the maid as it is for the governess.
If a man does something he shouldn't, it is we who take the blame. It is, she agreed. Fortunately, a butler and housekeeper wouldn't stand for a man who took liberties.
Not a member of the staff, anyway, and if there was trouble with a male guest, Miss Hughes would rearrange the work assignments to keep the object of his attentions below stairs as much as possible.
And what of Mr. Barrow? Have you known him long? We've worked together for years, Anna said, but we've only become friendly recently. He isn't an easy person to get to know.
Yes, Peter says this as well, Liesl said. Up ahead of them, Mr. Fitzroy pointed at a plant and said something Thomas apparently felt was funny.
He seems very fond of him, though. Mr. Fitzroy of Thomas, I mean.
Liesl nodded. It has been since they were boys, I think.
Suddenly, it struck Anna that Thomas was not play-acting courtship, as he had done with her and Gwen. He was, in fact, walking out with his sweetheart.
This had not precisely been a secret before, but somehow she had managed not to think of it that way. In the back of her mind, she supposed she'd assumed that it was all a matter of him wanting what others had, pretending he had a sweetheart because William and Madge and Daisy all had them.
Have they been together all this time?
Anna wondered.
No,
said Liesl, pausing to inspect a tropical flower.
Thomas is, as you say, very pretty, yes?
He certainly was.
Auntie knows it. Yes, and you are familiar with the promises that men will make to a girl who is extremely pretty. I've heard things,
Anna allowed. Every girl entering service was told not to believe a gentleman who'd say he'd marry you, no matter how convincing he was.
Men who are different are not so very different, if you understand. And Peter is not one to make promises that he cannot keep, so how can he compete? I think I understand.
Mostly. She wasn't sure what promises the men in question could have made. Not married, certainly. But that was probably one of the details that it was best not to speculate about.
But how? Now, perhaps Thomas has, as you say, wised up.
She gave a very continental shrug.
Perhaps.
Thomas was glad enough to finish with the Palm House, even though being out on the path meant having Liesl on his arm again. It hadn't seemed too warm in the Grease house when they'd first gone in, but it had gotten a little stifling over time, and now they were back outside again. The July afternoon felt like a spring morning. "What now?" Peter asked brightly. "I think that's the pagoda up there," Thomas said, pointing. "Isn't it?" Peter glanced around him at Liesl, and she said,
"Yes, I think so."
They turned their steps that way, and in a few moments the path turned to give them an excellent view of it.
"Do you climb up in it?"
Anna asked. Thomas wasn't sure. The guidebook had said something about excellent views, and also it being closed for repairs. Since it had been written before any of them were born, there was really no telling. "Maybe," he said. No one else volunteered a different answer. "What are they for, anyway?" he asked, glancing at Liesl. If any of them knew, it would be her. "Real ones, I mean. In China." The guidebook had been very clear that they were Chinese.
Some sort of pagan temples, I think," she said.
They walked a little bit more. "Oh, there, look," Peter said. "There's people on one of the balconies or whatever you call them. I guess you do climb up in it." When they neared the pagoda, Liesl nodded toward a uniformed man who was standing sentry near it.
"He must work here. Maybe he'll know about what they use them for in China."
He looked like a policeman to Thomas, and in the circumstances, he'd have rather not drawn any attention to themselves. But before he could think of a way to say so, Liesl was steering them over towards the possible policeman, to whom she said,
"Excuse me, sir, do you work for the gardens? We had a question."
"Yes, miss. Q Constabulary. How can I help?"
Thomas concentrated on looking completely normal and not at all as though he was planning on committing a crime later that evening. Or possibly committing one right now, depending on how you looked at it.
"We were wondering about pagodas in China. What they're used for."
The man shook his head.
"I'm sorry, miss, I wouldn't be knowing that. You might ask in one of the museums. I do know it was built in 1762 and has 253 steps.
He added hopefully.
"Thank you, that's very interesting."
Both Thomas and Peter were very quiet as they walked away from the policeman. After a moment, Liesel asked, "Is something wrong?" "It's just that we usually try to avoid drawing the attention of the police," Peter said apologetically.
Oh,
Liesel said.
yes, how silly of me.
"We aren't doing anything wrong," Anna said sharply. "You're not," Thomas muttered.
Nor are you,
said Liesel.
not really.
Thomas didn't argue the point lest Peter accuse him of spoiling things. The views, once they got a few floors up in the pagoda, did take his mind off things. Each level had an open terrace where you could walk the whole way around the building and look down on the gardens below. After about 6 or 7 levels, the girls said they had had enough of climbing stairs, but that Thomas and Peter should go the rest of the way up if they liked. So they did, though Peter was a little out of breath by the time they reached the top level. "Oh, come on," Thomas said. "You must go up more stairs than that, waiting at table at a dinner party. I know I do." "Not all at once," Peter pointed out, "and Sir Henry doesn't have many dinner parties." They had the place nearly to themselves, except for a young couple who were taking advantage of the isolation to get in a bit of kissing. They sprang apart, the girl smoothing her dress when they realized they weren't alone anymore, but Peter just said, "Carry on, don't mind us." And they walked around to the other side of the building to give them a little privacy. Thomas would have liked to imitate them, but he and Peter had a lot more to fear than a moment of embarrassment if they were caught at it. Instead, he stuck 2 cigarettes in his mouth, lit them both, and gave one to Peter. "Do you suppose we're meant to smoke up here?" Thomas shrugged. "I didn't see a notice saying we're not." There had been some in the Palm House. "If someone tells us otherwise, we'll stop." "You didn't get 2 years at hard labor for smoking when you weren't supposed to." "Well, be careful with the ashes. We don't want to set this thing on fire." "Not when we're at the top of it, no," Thomas agreed. They leaned on the railing, looking out toward the ornamental lake. Thomas, for reasons he didn't quite understand, started talking about William and Daisy's picnic at Downton's Lake. He talked about the food, and Daisy mistaking the folly for an actual rune, and ended with, "And William's rubbish at skipping stones," even though he wasn't. When he'd finished, Peter just said, "It's too bad Daisy wasn't brought along to London, so they could have a proper date." What that had to do with anything, Thomas had no idea. After a while, a group of small boys thundered up the stairs and began racing around the terrace, throwing acorns at the people below, and Peter and Thomas headed back down to where the girls were waiting. On the way down, they passed a cute constable puffing his way up the stairs. When they met up again, Liesel and Anna suggested that it was about time for tea, so they set off looking for a nice spot to have it. Thomas found himself walking more slowly. Once they'd had their tea, it would be nearly time to go home, and then the only real date he was likely to ever have in his life would be over. He rejected 2 picnic spots out of hand, but finally accepted the third, a little grove of trees on a hill overlooking the lake. The girls started laying out the picnic things, and Thomas took charge of the champagne. It was a full bottle, not even touched. Peter had to have nicked it. And when he took off the foil, he folded it neatly and put it in his coat pocket. "Oh," Peter said as Thomas started prying out the cork. "What?" Thomas asked. "I didn't think about bringing any glasses," he said. "We might have to pass the bottle around like pirates." "Here," Anna took a handful of tin cups out of the basket. "Miss Trot packed them for the lemonade." Thomas took the cups and began filling them. "What would Carson say?" he teased. "I'm not sure this is much of an improvement over the pirate option."
"Well, we won't tell him,"
Anna said. "I don't know," Thomas said. "He might have a heart attack." "Then you'd have to hold things together until they recovered," Peter pointed out. "That's really going to cut into your spare time." "All right, you've convinced me." It took surprisingly little time for them to finish their picnic tea, and I suppose they had all worked up quite an appetite with all the walking. "I was going to suggest we feed the crumbs to the ducks next," Peter said, "but we don't seem to have left any." "I saw where they were selling ice cream back the way we came," Thomas said. "Anyone fancy an ice cream? I'll go get them." They all agreed that was a good idea, and Thomas got up. Anna had supposed that Peter would go with him, one more chance for them to steal a moment alone. But instead, after a meaningful exchange of glances between Peter and Liesel, She joined him, saying she'd help carry them back. It would have taken a much slower woman than Anna to miss that there was something Peter wanted to say to her in private, but he didn't waste any time getting to the point, leaning forward and saying intently, "You know you've got to keep it a secret, don't you? About Thomas. Only he was worried that you didn't."
"I know," she said. "I only meant to let him know that I didn't mind, but... well, I must have said it wrong."
He relaxed back against the grass. "That's what I thought. More likely you said it fine and he took it wrong. He does that."
"Yes,"
Anna agreed.
"he does."
Peter sighed. "It's not easy for him, you know. I mean, it's not easy for any of us, but he takes things so much to heart." Involuntarily, Anna glanced over in the direction that Thomas had gone.
"You're still talking about Thomas?"
"No, he does," Peter answered. "He's not cut out for our sort of life, not really." Anna gave him a skeptical look. If he meant what she thought he meant, he was surely mistaken. "No, I mean, he's an invert, of course he is. If he could convince himself even for a minute that he wasn't, he'd be married by now and have half a dozen kids he could spoil the socks off of. At first I expected him to go that way. A lot of us do. But he's not that good a liar." Now that Anna could agree with.
"Though it's not for lack of practice,"
she noted. "No," he said sadly. "Not for lack of practice." Anna studied him.
"You really like him, don't you?"
"Sometimes I think I love him," Peter said. "But I could never be enough for him. The only way anyone could be is if they could remake the world to be a better place for people like us. Barring that, he's better off settling for someone rich enough to pretend it already is."
"You don't mean that,"
Anna said, thinking of what Liesel had said about men making promises they couldn't keep. "No," Peter said. "They're no good for him either. I think he might even have figured that out. But he's figured it out several times before. The trouble is there's nothing to be done. Stolen moments, that's all we're ever going to get." That, Anna understood suddenly, was why Thomas was so angry all the time, why he couldn't stand to see other people happy.
"Aren't there, I don't know, places where it's more accepted?"
"Not really." Peter shook his head. "There are places where it's not against the law, but it's not accepted. And we'd still have to make a living. That's the thing about, the first son of the 6th Viscount or whatever. He can tell him they'll get a flat in Paris instead of housekeeping, and tell anyone who doesn't like it to saw it off. And it sounds almost plausible, except they never mean it." Peter took out a cigarette. "Do you mind if I—"
"Go ahead,"
she said. So that was what they'd promised him. Marriage hadn't been too far off the mark. Once Peter had lit it, he added, "He'd want me to make sure you know it's been years since he's fallen for anything that obvious. The last one only promised him a job." In fact, Anna suspected Thomas wouldn't want her to know any of this. She thought of her half of a romance with Mr. Bates smothered in its cradle. He never promised her anything, because he was married, and possibly worse. But she'd have rather had that than a lot of empty promises. Not that she was the sort of woman men made empty promises to.
"Isn't what you have to offer better than that? Better than lies?"
"What I have to offer is nothing." Thomas, she thought, would have snarled it at her and either stalked off or puffed himself up like an offended cat.
Peter said it a little wistfully, with a sad smile. "Except how you feel,"
Anna pointed out. "Except that." Another sad smile. "And that and a bottle of champagne makes for a pleasant afternoon." When Thomas and Liesel came back, carrying 2 paper cups of ice cream apiece, Peter was sitting with his knees drawn up and one arm loosely around them. He only did that when he was feeling unhappy, Thomas knew. He glanced sharply at Anna, who was packing the picnic things away, and demanded, "Did you say something to upset Peter?" "What?" Anna said. "Don't be silly." Peter got up, taking the ice creams from Thomas. "It's just that you were gone so long that we thought you'd gotten lost. It was very sad." "Was it now?" Thomas said. "Yes. You see, the ice cream would have melted." He looked at Anna. "Which one would you like? I've got chocolate and..."
"They're all chocolate,"
Liesel said wearily. "Here." She gave Thomas one of hers, and they all sat down. "They had chocolate and vanilla. Thomas explained. That's why it took so long, because we had to argue about what we were getting. Lizel thought we ought to get a vanilla one in case somebody fancied it, but nobody likes vanilla.
I'd have eaten it if nobody else wanted it,
Lizel said. Peter said, Don't be silly, I'd have eaten it. At the same moment as Anna said, I'd not have minded. But I said, Thomas continued, if we do that, then all three of you will offer to take it. He looked at Lizel. Didn't I say that?
You did say that,
she sighed. This way we all get to eat it while it's still cold, instead of arguing over who gets to have the one that nobody really wants. Thomas finished, and he probably ended up stuck with it himself somehow. Ah, Peter said, taking a bite of his ice cream. You made the right decision then. Well done, darling. Thomas looked sideways at him. Peter wasn't one of those who went around calling other men darling all the time, and Thomas hoped he wasn't about to start. But he only said, Thank you. The ice cream wasn't quite as good as Miss Patmore made, but they were eating it while it was still cold, and didn't have to run for their lives after snitching it, so Thomas supposed it all even out. After finishing it, they began walking slowly back toward the gates, talking of things like what a lovely day out it had been, and whether they'd have to wait for the tram when they got to the stop. They didn't, as it happened, but the tram was more crowded than it had been at midday, and they couldn't find 4 seats together. The best they could do was 2 seats for the girls, and then Peter and Thomas had to stand in the aisle. It was a bit too noisy for much conversation, and definitely not anything they didn't want overheard by any number of bored strangers. But the motion did provide plenty of excuses for Thomas and Peter to bump into each other. At their stop, Peter and Lizel got off the tram and walked them back to Grantham House, even though there was a stop later on that was closer to the Denhams' house. They stood awkwardly in the alley for a moment until Lizel said,
Thank you, Mr. Barrow, for a lovely afternoon.
And Anna said the same to Peter. After Anna had stepped inside, Peter said, Still on for the crit later? Course. He followed her in. Thomas thought to check if he'd gotten anything in the afternoon post, but before he got to the servants' hall, he ran into Mr. Carson and William in the corridor outside the butler's pantry, talking intently. He slowed his steps, wondering what was up, and Mr. Carson said,
Since you're back, Thomas, you won't mind serving in the dining room tonight.
Yes, he bloody well did! I was going back out, as a matter of fact, meeting a mate for a pint, as it's my half-day. It's all right, Mr. Carson, William said. I'd just as soon keep busy, really. Thomas glanced back and forth between them. What's happened?
William's mother has taken a turn for the worse,
Carson intoned. Damn it all. It wasn't the least bit fair. William had had 3 days off the last time his mother was meant to be on her deathbed. But there was no point trying to stand up for yourself when someone else's dying mum was involved. Thomas had learned that one the hard way. Right, what train are you getting? Maybe there was some way he could salvage some portion of the evening, offer to help William get his bags to the station or something, and then snatch a hour or so afterwards. Nothing's been decided, William began, but Carson interrupted him.
You see, William, even Thomas thinks you should go. I'll speak to her ladyship about it tonight, not that she will object, and you'll get the first train in the morning.
Yes, Mr. Carson, William said. If he wasn't leaving until the morning, there really wasn't any reason Thomas needed to miss out on the rest of his evening. In that case, Carson sighed.
William, if you're sure you're feeling up to it.
I am, William said. I can do my job.
All right then, Thomas,
Carson said.
If you insist.
Thank you, Mr. Carson, Thomas said. Carson withdrew into his pantry, and Thomas continued on his way to the servants' hall, William dogging his steps, for lack of anything better to do, apparently. Thomas asked, Don't you want to go? Thought you liked your mum. Of course I like my mum. What kind of question is that? Thomas shrugged. Never got on with mine. It wasn't entirely true. He had when he'd been very small. They reached the servants' hall, and Thomas checked his pigeonhole, which was empty. You might as well go, then. They, he jerked his head upward, indicating the upstairs lot, were just as soon servants were built in factories like motor cars, but until that day comes, you're allowed to have a mum. Well, William said, if it won't make any trouble. Fat chance of that. Oh, it will. Not for you, and not for them, but I'm not going to have a minute to myself the rest of the time we're down here. William looked uncomfortable, and for a moment Thomas almost felt badly for him. That was all right, then. Tell you what, though, he went on. Tell Mr. Carson you'll stay up to lock the door behind me when I get in. You won't be sleeping much anyway, will you? And we'll call this square. William chewed that over for a moment. All right. He left, and once he'd gone, Bates lowered the newspaper he'd been reading and said, Really? In a tone of scornful incredulity. Really? Thomas answered. It was a perfectly fair deal when you thought about it. With William gone, there'd be no chance of escaping the house again. He went upstairs and pottered around a bit, having a wash and changing into his other suit, but he thought it wise to be out the door well before the upstairs dinner started, and so he arrived at the Criterion Bar quite early. None of his set were there yet. In fact, the place was nearly empty, except for the large table where the artsy types congregated. They, the others had told him, were in more or less constant occupation from opening to last orders. Thomas sat by himself in the usual spot at the bar, taking advantage of the need to buy his own drink to get a whiskey and soda. Usually, you ended up with either some sort of syrupy modern cocktail, or a pint if the bloke buying it for you didn't think a working-class lad would know how to drink anything else. So it made a nice change. Though, paying for it, he was reminded why their lot didn't buy their own drinks here. He'd have to make it last.
So what's he like then?
Mr. Bates asked.
Thomas's friend.
They were sitting at the servants' hall table, having finished dressing their charges. Nice, Anna said. She tried to think of another description. Really nice.
Wonder what he sees in Thomas then,
Mr. Bates quipped. Anna would have agreed with him if not for the conversation she'd had with Mr. Fitzroy while Thomas was getting the ice cream. Don't be nasty,
Sorry,
Mr. Bates said. She might have gone into more detail about why he shouldn't, but Miss O'Brien was at the other end of the table, apparently intent on a piece of mending, but almost certainly listening to every word. We had a nice day, and the gardens were lovely. Have you ever been?
Years ago,
Mr. Bates said.
It was a popular place to take a young lady on a Sunday afternoon, when I was a young man.
Anna wondered if she was meant to say that he was still young. He wasn't old, not really, but he was married. It still is, I'm sure. He had probably taken his wife there when they'd been courting. Hello, someone said, sitting on the bar stool next to Thomas's. He was a bloke about Thomas's age, maybe a few years older, clothes medium posh, accent several degrees posher. I'd expected this place to be a bit more lively, he added, looking around. It's early. Not a regular then, but knew the reputation of the place. I'm Kitten Orange, by the way, he said. Thomas, and you didn't know you didn't give out your last name in a place like this. First time out of the gate, or police. He caught the bartender's eye and raised one eyebrow a fraction of an inch. The bartender shrugged, just as minutely. He didn't know either. Can I get you another one of those? Kit Norwich asked, indicating Thomas's near-empty glass. He'd been drinking it as slowly as he could, but it was still at least half an hour before he could even start looking for Peter. Probably more like an hour, and it wasn't against the law to let a stranger in a bar treat you to a drink. I don't mind, but I'm meeting someone in a bit. Even if he hadn't been, the man wasn't rich enough or good-looking enough for Thomas to bother with ordinarily, but, as he'd said, it was early. If Kit missed the hint that he wasn't getting anything more in return for the drink than a bit of conversation, that was his lookout. 2 more of those, Kit told the bartender, who poured this round from a higher shelf than the first and charged him accordingly. Once the drinks were in front of them, he raised his and said, Cheers. Thomas did likewise. Not bad whiskey at all. So what line of work are you in? Kit asked. You didn't ask that either. I'm a commercial traveller in ladies' underclothes, Thomas said, deadpan. Oh, that's... Really? No, Thomas said. He'd better clear that up right away in case he was police. It's a joke. The punchline is that he sells patent apple cores or something. Oh, I see. Transvestitism. Funny. He chuckled nervously. I'm a writer. Magazines mostly. Occasionally newspapers. Whatever keeps the grocer's bill paid, really.
With an accent like that, he wouldn't be worrying about paying the grocer's bill. Not really.
But sometimes Tufts liked to play at earning a living. If he was one of those, he definitely wasn't worth bothering with. And a good thing, really, since Thomas would hate to stand up Peter. Anything I might have heard of? Kit paused, as if considering what sort of publications someone like Thomas might have heard of. I've had a few things in the Tatler. That's probably the most well-known one. I'm what they call a freelancer. I don't write for anyone in particular. Sure, I've heard of that. How's it work? Do you write things and then take them around to different magazines? Or do they tell you when they want something written? Little of both, really. Actually, what usually seems to happen is that I'll be taking around something I've written and they'll say, it's not really what readers are interested in, but you're not a bad writer. Come back with 500 words on the new woman, and we'll see. Or the servant problem, or our motor car's here to stay. You know, those things every magazine runs the same article about over and over.
Thomas did know. He read.
What kind of things do you like to write, then? Kit sighed, taking out his cigarette case and offering Thomas one. They lit up. I haven't really found a niche yet. I like to write things where I'm learning something new, taking my readers someplace they haven't been before. But the editors don't want to. That gave Thomas a moment's pause. You weren't working on an article about London's bohemian underbelly now, are you?
If he was, Thomas had better extricate himself from this conversation quickly.
Kit looked startled. Oh no, nothing like that. His expression turned thoughtful. But, well, no, I can't imagine where I could sell it, can you? He didn't, and even if he could, wouldn't have said so. This was all getting a bit too elaborate for a police operation, but still, there was such a thing as common sense. No. Kit went on to talk about how he'd tried to do something a bit different with one of his servant problem articles, going to one of the employment agencies and interviewing maids about why they refused the place, and left it after a short time. But of course, nobody wanted to print it. He was an interesting chap to talk to, really, and in other circumstances, Thomas might have put up with him a while longer, but as the place started to fill up, he couldn't help looking over at the door every time it opened to see if it was Peter coming in. Silly, really. He'd known Peter for donkey's years. There wasn't anything the least bit exciting about him. Except that they'd gone on a date earlier in the day. Probably Peter was even expecting that they'd pick up other people. They'd only had it off with each other a couple of times when there wasn't much else going. And the time in Yorkshire when there'd been nothing else at all going. Still, when the first of the lads turned up, one of the Daves, and looked inquiringly at Thomas, asking silently whether he ought to keep out of the way for a bit, Thomas waved him over, and when he made to sit next to Thomas, gestured for him to go down to Kit's other side instead. How you doing, Thomas? The David asked. He didn't think it was the David he'd run into earlier on this trip, one of the others. Probably. Not bad. Meeting Peter in a bit. To Kit he said, This is Dave. Dave? Kit. He's new. Kit offered his hand and said, Pleased to meet you, Dave. Ned, actually, said the Dave, shaking his head. Thomas leaned back to peer at him behind Kit's back. Since when? Since always, said Ned. I do look a bit like short Dave, I suppose. He looked a bit like all the Daves, but Thomas didn't argue the point. All right, then. Ned. He was never going to remember that between now and the next time he made it to London. By the time Peter did show up, Kit and Ned were deep in conversation. That was about what Thomas had wanted to happen, although he wouldn't have complained if he managed to get another drink before handing Kit over. Still, it was nice to see Peter, and even nicer when he leaned in and gave Thomas a kiss on the cheek, saying, I've been wanting to do that all day. Should we have a drink before we move on? Thomas suggested. All right. Thomas ordered another for himself, too, and paid for both of them. Have you eaten? Peter asked. I haven't. Thomas shook his head. There's bound to be some place between here and the other place, isn't there? There was no question whatsoever of eating here, not if they weren't getting someone else to pay for it. He wasn't even sure they'd be allowed. Sure, loads of places. Once they'd started in on their drinks, Thomas said, Did you know he's called Ned? Yes, Peter said, clearly wondering why Thomas was asking. I thought he was one of the Daves. Oh, you know what? He does look an awful lot like Dave the chauffeur. Oh, I wonder how he's doing. Why, doesn't he come around anymore? No, we got married and moved to Manchester, Liverpool, one of those places. Really? Dave the chauffeur was the one who had a bit of a thing for me, wasn't he? No, that was Short Dave. Thomas wasn't entirely sure he'd known that Short Dave and Dave the chauffeur were two different people. Short Dave was definitely too short to be a footman, so what did he do? Thomas thought about asking. Peter wasn't good at keeping track of that sort of thing, but decided it wasn't important and said instead, when do you need to be back? Not for ages. He's got a dinner with Lady D, and then he's going straight to his club. Peter had already shared with Thomas that when Sir Henry said he was going to his club after dinner, he meant the flat where he kept an actress and wouldn't be back before dawn. Good. Same here. But I probably won't get away again the rest of the time we're here. He explained about William's mum. We probably shouldn't make it too late, Peter said once he'd heard about the deal they had struck about William making sure it wasn't Carson waiting up for him. He's going to need his strength to face it. He won't sleep anyway, Thomas answered. The last time they thought she was dying, he was up pacing all hours, and they've got us sharing a room here, so I'm not getting a wink of sleep either. Somebody might as well get something out of it. I'm sure you're right, Peter said. But it's saying things like that, that gives people the idea you've no feeling at all. Now Peter was starting, and my feeling wasn't fair. I don't see how the two of us sitting in a room the size of a matchbox wearing on each other's nerves is going to help anything, Thomas argued, and it's certainly not going to stop his mum dying. No, Peter said. I suppose not. And it was Carson who said he wasn't leaving until the morning, not me. I suppose they must expect it to last the night. He'd have thought of that. Carson, I mean. Don't you think? Thomas hadn't thought of it until just now, but he wasn't in charge of William's travel plans. I'm sure he did, Peter agreed, his tone warmer. See, you do have a heart. No, I just don't want them all blaming me if he doesn't get back in time. I'm sure they won't. He drained his glass. Shall we go and see about dinner then? They ended up in a working-class pub where they got pints and slabs of meat pie for less than they'd paid for drinks at the Criterion. It wasn't a bad place, comfortable, and no toffs looking at you like you were a tart on the stroll. And Thomas would have just as soon stayed, except they had to make sure they didn't touch or gesture too much. Thomas had enough of that in his regular life, thanks. So they ate quickly and left. Once they were out on the pavement, Thomas said, Really, there ought to be places like that for our lot. Which lot do you mean? Peter asked, adding, Is this way? They turned down the narrow side street Peter had indicated. Our lot, Thomas said again. Men like us. Peter still didn't get it. Working class queers, Thomas said, whispering the last word. Oh, Peter said. What do you mean like that then? Just a decent place where you can get a drink with your mates. I mean, we go to the crit like it's our local, but as far as the rest of them are concerned, we're basically the whores down at the end of the bar. They let us in because the punters would stop coming if we didn't. Don't say that, Peter scowls. I'm not wrong. You're not, but... He sighed and shook his head. Tell me about this pub we ought to have then. For men like us, what's it like? Thomas hadn't really thought that far. Well, for one thing, it wouldn't be in a bloody cellar. The place they were going would be in a cellar. They always were, unless they were in an attic. Always crammed into the leftover space from something else. And you aren't always going there to find someone to have it off with. I mean, maybe you are, but not necessarily. Maybe just to have a drink and talk to people, like regular blokes who go to the pub. Only you don't have to pretend you're something you're not. They walked on a bit. Maybe there's a dartboard. Places for their sort never had a dartboard, and Thomas was good at darts. Peter chuckled. You're the only one I know who'd think of a thing like that. Thomas glared at him. It'd be nice, though. Yeah, the look Peter gave him in return was fond. It'd be nice. Down here. They turned into an alleyway, and then it was down a flight of grimy stairs to knock on a cellar door. That was a bit of all right. Thomas always hated the part where you had to walk through the brothel or the supper club where the dentists and accountants were dining in tawdry splendor with their mistresses as though to rub your face in the fact that what you were doing was even worse. Peter gave the password and they were admitted into the cellar. It was the usual sort of thing. Dark and slightly grimy, with low ceilings that kept the smoke right about in your face. But there was a dance floor and a band of sorts, a three-piece combo playing last year's rags with a singer who looked almost female. "So," Lady Mary said as Anna was doing up her dress before dinner, "how was Kew Gardens?"
"Lovely," she said. "We saw the pagoda and the palm house and had champagne and ice cream for our tea."
"Goodness," said Lady Mary, smoothing the front of her dress and preening in the mirror. "How cosmopolitan. Did you go with Bates?"
"No, my lady. It was Thomas and some friends of his, a Mr. Fitzroy and a Miss Shrantz."
Lady Mary glanced over her shoulder at Anna. "Thomas? I thought you didn't get on with him."
"He's grown on me quite a bit, my lady."
After a quick glance at her sisters, who didn't seem to be paying much attention, Lady Mary said delicately, "You know, I'm not sure he's the marrying kind." That answered that question.
"I'm not sure he is either. We're just friends."
"Ah, good." She dipped her head so that Anna could put a necklace on her. "Bit of a waste, though, when you had someone of that sort." Before Anna could decide quite how to reply, Lady Sybil asked, "What sort is that?" "Never mind, darling," Lady Mary said.
"I don't see any reason it would be a waste for a servant to be handsome," Lady Sybil insisted.
Anna and Lady Mary exchanged a glance.
"Quite right you are, my lady," Anna said, picking up Lady Sybil's dress.
"Of course," said Lady Mary. "I don't know what I was thinking. I do apologize." When the band took a break, Thomas and Peter retired to a table where some of their friends were sitting, Joey and Eddie and a couple of others. Syl was there too, but had abandoned the table to attempt to talk to the singer who was mingling with the crowd. The rest of the band had gone somewhere out of sight. Probably normal men, and they were hiding in case someone tried to buy them a drink or something. It really wasn't such a bad place, Thomas thought, as he caught up on recent events with Joey and Eddie. Once you got past the tawdry first impression, it was a mixed crowd as far as class went, but there were enough of their own sort that Thomas and Peter didn't look too out of place, though they did have to incline a lot of offers from blokes who thought they might be looking for more distinguished company. And even that was all right, because Peter had declined them, as though there weren't any question of doing otherwise. It did mean paying for their own drinks, but at the moment Thomas didn't mind overpaying for watered-down cocktails. It was getting a bit late, though, and when Joey went off with some chinless bloke in evening dress, Thomas said to Peter, "This place 2 rooms?" If they didn't, they'd have to come up with something else. Thomas wasn't going from walking out in Kew Gardens to having it off in the gents' toilets in the same day. The thought was just too depressing. "Sort of," Peter said, which Thomas knew meant some sort of cubicles, providing not exactly privacy, but a bit of help pretending you had it. "There's a place round the corner that'll let us in, but I'm getting a little short on funds." "So am I," Thomas admitted. "The other place would be a Tarts Hotel, and not a whole lot better, or safer than here." "We'll just have to make the best of it, then." They finished their drinks, and Peter led the way to the back. There was a woman minding the gates to paradise, middle-aged and common-looking. She took Peter's money and said only, "Number 8's free. It's a shilling extra if you don't clean up after yourselves and don't think I won't check." That was actually a good sign. Some of these places didn't appear to have been cleaned since the flood. They walked down a row of curtained cubicles from which emerged various sounds of passion. Cubicle number 8 was formed of rough plank walls on 3 sides, with a curtain serving as the 4th. The walls stopped at least a foot shy of the ceiling, and the curtain covered less than that. There was a candle in a bracket on the wall, which Thomas lit, a narrow bed with an oilcloth cover, probably for the best considering how many people would have used it before them, and a grubby washstand. The essentials, then, if nothing else. He and Peter took off their jackets and ties, sat on the edge of the bed, and kissed. Finally! Soon it turned into the sort of kissing you couldn't do in Kew Gardens no matter who you were. Languorous necking with open mouths and their bodies pressed against each other. And Thomas forgot all about the squalor of their surroundings. Thomas always liked this part, especially when it was with someone he knew. But as it grew more frenetic, he finally had to draw back a bit, keeping one hand on Peter's chest and say, "If we're going to do anything more than rub up against each other, we better decide what it is, before we lose the moment." Peter rubbed the back of Thomas's neck. "What do you fancy?" "Oh, I don't know." For actual buggery, Thomas liked considerably more privacy than this, to say nothing of reliable washing-up facilities, though it did seem a shame he'd never managed to do that with Peter. Sucking off was about right for the setting, but Thomas always felt like you were somehow far away from each other doing that, unless you tried the succinct neuf, which was an awful lot of work, and really sort of like trying to rub your stomach and pat your head at the same time. "Why don't I just go between your legs? That was nice." You could hold on to one another while you were doing it, but it wasn't as complicated as the other thing. "All right." When they'd both finished, more or less at the same time, Peter grabbed the grimy towel from the washstand to clean them off, and they settled down for a moment on the narrow bed, shoulder to shoulder. Thomas lit a cigarette, and they passed it between them companionably. "Do you think you'll get back to London before next summer?" Peter asked. Back to reality, then. "Doubt it, unless they decide to open the house when it comes down to the House of Lords." They usually didn't. Peter passed the cigarette back. "Here, you take the last rag." Thomas did, and flung the dog end into the wash bowl. Slowly, they put their clothes back in order. Peter did up Thomas's tie for him. "One more round of drinks before we go?" Thomas suggested, and Peter agreed. When they got back out to the main room, the band was back on stage. Joey was nowhere to be seen. One of the Daves had joined the group, and Syl was wearing a red evening gown, pinned up clumsily in the back where it didn't fit him, and at least a decade behind the mode to boot. "Oh, for pity's sake," Thomas said. Peter swatted him on the shoulder. "Be nice. No one's asking you to wear one." They collected their drinks from the bar, and Thomas said, "But the regular people think we're all like that. I don't think we'll have that kind in my imaginary pub." Stopping in his tracks, Peter gave him a reproving look. "You're the one always going on about how the regular people ought to leave us alone to do what we like. So leave him alone and let him do what he likes. Yeah?" He had a point. "Oh, all right," Thomas said. "I suppose he can come to the imaginary pub." And when Peter told Syl how nice he looked, Thomas made a sound of vague agreement. "Thank you," Syl said, preening. "Miss Cerise, let me try it on." That must be the singer, and explain the poor fit. She was about twice as wide as Syl. Well, if Syl wanted to risk getting nicked in somebody else's evening gown, that was his own lookout, Thomas supposed. They talked for a bit until Peter and Thomas had finished their drinks and took their leave. It was late enough, and dark enough, that they dared link arms for a bit, though they'd have to stop once they were in a neighborhood slightly less disreputable than this. For a moment, if they saw a bobby, they could always start stumbling as if they were drunk and holding each other up. "This really was a perfect day," Peter said as they walked. It wasn't, and Thomas could have listed all the ways it wasn't, but decided not to spoil the moment. "Yeah, it was nice. I wish..." But he didn't say what he wished, because that would spoil the moment too. They walked a little further on, and Peter said suddenly, "Thomas." "Yes?" "You remember how we were talking earlier about how Short Dave had a bit of a thing for you?" "Uh-huh. Why was he bringing that up?" "I always rather did too." Thomas stopped and looked at him. "Really?" The idea was so new, so startling, that he couldn't quite get his head around it. Perhaps the date ought to have made it a bit obvious, but he'd figured that was just Peter being kind. It was like that. He'd been doing kind things for Thomas ever since they met. Helped him find his way in Lady Waterstone's house, introduced him to the places men like them could go, bought him drinks, and held his hand every time Thomas got his foolish heart broken. That was just what Peter... Oh. What, all this time? Well, not when you were 14, Peter said. I'd have felt like I was robbing the cradle. You're not even 2 years older than me. That was beside the point, but it was easier to argue about something unimportant than to look head on at what Peter had just said. It seemed like a lot back then, Peter shrugged. And then you grew up and you could have anybody you wanted. No, I couldn't. Thomas lit a cigarette. You should have said something. We could have... What exactly? Had it off a few more times than they had already. That was about it. That's why, said Peter. They resumed walking. And I did think one of those other blokes might make you happy. Take you away to that flat in Paris or the Greek island, or... That sort of thing doesn't really happen, but if it was going to happen to anyone, it would be you. Why is that? Because you look like a film star, love. And then once you get past all the you-ness, you can be so sweet and hopeful. I can never understand how anyone could bear to disappoint you. Pretty easily, as it turns out, Thomas noted, handing Peter the cigarette. Anyway, Peter said, we're older now, and I was thinking maybe once in a while I could probably manage to get a couple of days off in a row and come up in Yorkshire to see you. His expression was soft and fond and hopeful, and for a moment Thomas didn't know what to say. On the face of it, it didn't sound like he was suggesting anything much, except that it wasn't what people like them did. You grabbed what you could when you could grab it and didn't bother trying to build a future because you weren't going to get one. Looked at like that, it was the nearest either of them was ever going to get to a proposal. That's it, I'm afraid, Peter said. That's what I have to offer. It's not Paris. It's not even a cottage. But he wasn't lying. You should have somebody, Peter had said that day under the tree in Yorkshire. Somebody nice. And there was nobody nicer than Peter. I'd like that. He said it quietly, but he knew Peter would hear. I'd like that a lot. Won't be easy, though. Peter'd have to stay in York for one thing, so it would be a project to get time off at the same time he did. There was no question of smuggling him into Thomas's room at Downton. The others might be willing to turn a blind eye to his going on a date, but not that. He couldn't stay in the village pub either. A man coming even as often as once a year for no apparent purpose but to visit a servant at the big house would cause comment. So he'd be in York, or at the most Ripon, and that would require Thomas to get a whole afternoon or evening off if they were to so much as have a chance to look at one another. No, Peter said. Won't be easy. But what is? Not a whole lot. With a quick glance up and down the street, no one was watching. He took Peter's hand. All right, he said. Then that's what we'll do. Peter smiled at him and squeezed his hand. It'll be good, he said. We're right, like always, and, well, maybe one day there will be something more. You know, Andy was telling me they're looking for a new butler at his place, and one of the candidates said he wanted 3 weeks off every year to go on holiday. Suppose that ever catches on. We could take them together. When we're both butlers? Thomas asked. Well, if butlers get 3 weeks, I think valets and first footmen would get at least 2, don't you? Thomas didn't think Carson would go on holiday if Lady Mary personally held a gun to his head and ordered him to do it, and certainly wouldn't let anyone else do it either, but said, Right, stands to reason. Bates sat at the table in the servants' hall, leafing through a magazine and listening to the tick of the old carriage clock on the mantelpiece as the night grew later and later. He'd sent William up to bed hours ago, both because it was the decent thing to do, and because Thomas's return would be an excellent opportunity to give Thomas a piece of his mind about keeping William up until all hours while his mother was dying, so he could engage in Heavens knew what sort of debauchery. By the time the kitchen door opened, admitting a murmur of voices from outside, he thought 2 or 3 times about just going up to bed himself. Being locked out for what little remained of the night would serve Thomas just about right, but had restrained himself for the dual reasons that Anna wouldn't like it and Thomas would certainly blame William for the offense. Now, finally, was his moment. He wasn't going to lose his temper, not like that other time. No, he'd just calmly and clearly tell Thomas he was being a thoughtless little piece of slime, and that Bates, for one, was tired of it. The door closed again, and Bates waited, but Thomas didn't appear. Slowly, carefully, Bates walked as quietly as a man his size could manage down the passage to the kitchen, where there was a window looking out on the alley behind the house. Somewhere around 1 a.m., Bates had switched off the light over the back door, deciding that Thomas didn't deserve to have a light left on for him, but it was on now, and Thomas was standing by the back steps with the man from earlier in the day. Fitzroy heard something like that. Fitzroy said something, and Thomas laughed, ducking his head coquettishly. The two clapped hands, and Thomas said something that made the other man smile, then put one arm round him and kissed him on the cheek. Very quietly, Bates went back to his seat in the servants' hall.